My case. So this case here is kind of an interesting case that I really enjoyed. It was very complicated, but we're calling it a complex visual rehabilitation in post-RK patient. So this was an LAL patient that was actually a 70-year-old retired female optometrist, which made things extra exciting. So her history here was positive for RK surgery in 1993. She had 8 radial incisions as well as 2 limbal relaxing incisions in each eye. She had previously had bilateral horseshoe retinal tear repair in 2011. Late 2024 is when she had cataract surgery, and we chose to do an RX site light adjustable lens. Her ocular history is also positive just for severe dry eye. She was a glaucoma suspect. And then during her journey post-operatively, she did experience some persistent iritis, which we'll kind of review some of that. Pre-surgery data. So a little bit of myopia. She had about 2.25 diopters of SIL in her right eye, best corrected to 20/40 pre-surgery. The left eye, she had about 1.5 diopters of myopia and 3 diopters of SIL and best corrected to 20/50. Her case kind of matched this. She has almost 2 diopters of corneal astigmatism pre-operatively and 2.5 diopters of astigmatism in her K readings. And our goal was just to give her some functional vision with LAL customization. She has high SIL. We were trying to manage that, her corneal instability because of her previous RK, as well as treating her dry eyes, which were actually quite severe.
So it's 34 diopter flat case.
Yes.
Oof.
Yes.
To deal with that. Sorry, carry on.
That's okay. So, persistent iritis, which we'll be dealing with, these are some complications we ran into, delayed our light treatments, her severe dry eye, which created a lot of fluctuations. And that was really the biggest challenge in this case. And so our goal was just to kind of, deal with that instability of the RK, of the tear film, as well as the postoperative inflammation. We had her on a pretty hefty regimen for her dry eyes. She was taking Cequa twice a day, preservative-free artificial tears 4 times a day, Mibo 4 times a day. We were really trying to do everything we could to stabilize the tear film. So she was always wearing glasses. She wasn't a contact lens wearer because she couldn't tolerate contact lenses because of her surface disease. So the interesting thing actually with this patient, because she was a retired optometrist, she also had a full examination lane in her office, which was a blessing and a curse, more of a blessing, I think, in this case, because she was constantly refracting herself and understood the fluctuations. And so it wasn't me just telling her that she had to follow the protocols. She was seeing it on a daily basis. But she came in, for a 3-week post-op refraction and possible light treatment. And so she ended up presenting with some persistent iritis. So we kind of held off on treating her, wanted to make sure we treated the inflammation first. So we increased her prednisone to QID, and I had her maintain the prednisone until she returned in a couple weeks. But, post-surgical, that first real refraction. So she's got a little bit of hyperopia, about a diopter and 3/4 worth of astigmatism in both eyes. But, remarkably, she was correcting to 20/20 in both eyes. So that was great. She returned a couple weeks later. And so her iritis was resolved. So I started her on a taper of her prednisone. But I told her I wanted her to maintain it at a BID dosing just to give her a little extra help there with her ocular surface dryness and to help stabilize the tear film there. Her refraction here was about 1/4 diopter of hyperopia, 2.25 diopters of SIL in that right eye, and she was correcting to 20/20. The left eye, about 3/4 diopter of hyperopia and 2 diopters of SIL, and she was correcting to 20/20 minus. So we did initiate her first LDD treatment at that visit. Our target was plano in the right eye and a -1 with monovision in the left eye. She ended up coming back 3 weeks later. She had some family medical issues, which kind of delayed her follow-up visits, and that kind of slowed her progress here. She came in, she was seeing 20/20 minus in the right eye, 20/70 in the left eye. And we're kind of getting closer to our target. We kind of knocked out the astigmatism in the right eye. She had a little bit of myopia left over and, still a little bit of astigmatism in the left eye there. So we proceeded with a second LDD treatment to try and achieve our plano in the right eye and -1 in the left eye target. A week later, she came in. She said she was happy with her right eye. Left eye, not quite there. She had, after that last light treatment, stopped all of her dry eye treatments. So we kind of had a little bit of instability here. She wasn't seeing as well as she'd like. She was self-refracting herself and on the daily noticing fluctuations in that refraction as well. So once again, didn't do any treatments, put a pause on everything, and really stressed compliance with her dry eye regimen. A week later, she comes back, she's compliant and happy. So right eye was great. Left eye, she wanted a little bit of a tweak there, wanted to knock out a little bit more of that astigmatism that she had. But because she was in a happy place in the right eye, we did decide to lock in the first eye or the right eye, and then gave her a tertiary treatment in her left eye. So she didn't come in for 3 weeks again, family issues that were happening. And she complained that her right eye after that lock-in wasn't as good as it was prior to the lock-in. She was still using her Cequa, but she had kind of stopped everything else. So she didn't use any artificial tears, wasn't using Mibo. She was using, she said she was using them PRN. And then her prednisone, she had stopped altogether. This also happened to be timed with the dead of winter when, dryness is at its peak, and that was exacerbating her dry eyes as well as creating more of that instability. So once again, we put a pause on treatments and come on back. Because of family issues, once again, we didn't see her for 2 months. So during that time, because of her family issues, she really kind of fell off on her dry eye regimen, came down to just Cequa once a day, pred maybe every other day, kind of artificial tears, stopped her Mibo altogether, and her refraction was just all over the place. So another pause, another compliance talk, and we moved on. So comes back a week later, compliant and happy. So a common theme here, when she's compliant, she's good. When she's not compliant with her dry eye regimen, she's all over the place and notices the fluctuations. But she was great. She was happy. She was loving life, but then was nervous about locking in because her philosophy was, well, what if we can make it better? And so I think this was the key where, we talk about this as a collaboration with patients where we're working together, with this team approach. And I kind of felt at this point, I had to just kind of take the reins and say, all right, look at where we started. Look at your scenario. You are a post-RK patient. You've had retinal detachment repairs. You've got severe dry eye. You're seeing 20/20. We didn't know that this was even going to be an option for you. And at this point, what do you not have that you wanted? We achieved her monovision that she was happy with. And so finally she was like, okay, you're right. And I think it's just hard to kind of pull that trigger. And the more knowledge that you have, I think sometimes complicates things a lot more. I think, we could all say that we'd probably be terrible patients when it comes to this because, we have too much of an opinion. But, I sat back and I was like, listen, I think we've achieved everything we wanted to do. And she agreed. And then we moved forward. We did her second lock-in in the right eye, first lock-in in the right eye, first lock-in in the left eye. She returned a week later, was thrilled. She's seen 20/20 in the right eye, 20/30 in the left eye. She was reading J2 at near. She was thrilled with that. We did her final lock-in. And, a lot of keys in this case, this was definitely a long drawn out case. They typically don't last this long, but, there was no reason to be rushing this case. We needed to properly time this to get the best possible outcome for her, making sure that her family life was in order, making sure that her compliance with her dry eyes was in order, so we could get that perfect customization with the light treatments. This is a huge example of how you have to really be treating that ocular surface, because when you're not, there's so many fluctuations that does impact the results. And then that patient engagement, I think that's so crucial here. You need the patient to be compliant with follow-ups, whether it's the postoperative regimen, and just understand that this is a process. This took, what we did 23 weeks. So this was almost a 6-month journey that we were on together. But in the end, everyone was happy. So, team-based, that's a big thing that we always want to stress. Don't rush the LAL treatments. Wait until you stabilize. Look out for inflammation, because inflammation can definitely impact your results. And then, optimizing the surface. And, one of the things that we do in our practice, and I'm sure across the board, is, we're treating the dry eyes aggressively before surgery, during surgery, or, during the first post-operative period, as well as, long-term there. And that's really crucial.
Wow, that's awesome. You've got so many pearls in there. I think so many huge key points. I think, if nothing else, this case definitely delivers the idea that there's a psychological component to this process, especially working with an optometrist who presumably has some knowledge of high-level optics, right? Nancy, have you gotten, or have you changed the way you present this to patients? You've been doing this for over 5 years. So how do you explain to a patient that there may be some delays, or do you set those expectations beforehand? Have you changed how you talk about that?
It varies so drastically from patient to patient, but one of the most important things that I stress is the fact that, this is going to be at a minimum a 6-week journey. But every time we need to make another change, we've got to add extra time to this. And, there is no timeline. There's no reason to rush it. And that is something that I do discuss with patients. But, I don't go into much more detail than that. Those patients that were prolonging it, they understand why it's being prolonged, whether it's, persistent inflammation, whether it's, managing the surface disease, whether it's just the patient's own timeline, they're vacationing, they have, other priorities. There's no real, we don't have to have an endpoint to this. The patient, if they're wearing their glasses at all times, their UV protection, we can prolong this as long as they want to prolong it. It's 6 months isn't something that's typical, but it happens every once in a blue moon.
So I'm curious what the rest of the panel thinks too. I know you did CEQA in this case, and I'm assuming you have a kind of standard regimen. Do you have a standard regimen for OSD pre-op?
Yes and no, as far as do I have a preferred medication? Not necessarily. My go-to is really what's covered under the patient's insurance. I think anything is better than nothing. I do want to have some sort of dry eye regimen for the patients and artificial tears during the process. This was obviously a little bit more of an extreme case because she had pretty significant dry eye disease, and it, had a significant impact on her postoperative management. But, most patients don't get this aggressive of a treatment. I'm putting them on tears and some sort of, drop of choice. It's either what I have a sample of or what's covered under their insurance. And I think they all fare decently well.
I think that's fair. I think that's the U.S. health system in 2025. Whatever's covered, nothing. Something is better than nothing.
Yeah.
Tanner, Jessica, do you guys have any comments on the dry eye component to this?
One of my big takeaways from this case is this patient had, as you mentioned, a lot of complexifiers. The post-RK, history of RD repair, some early intraocular inflammation, but it seemed like largely it was managing her ocular surface. Yeah. And when she, followed your drop, obviously, I think the history of RK probably led you to delaying the adjustments to begin with. But the reason for, pausing the adjustment process was largely because of her ocular surface wasn't great. And I don't, to answer Nick's question, I don't have a specific regimen for managing dry eye in the postoperative period or even perioperative period. I do a lot of punctal plugs in my LAL patients. I also, reach for like a cyclosporin and do a fair amount of Levi, and Mibo when we can get it covered or we have a surplus of samples is a fantastic option. Mm-hmm. But I probably would have approached it the same way you did. And thinking about the time aspect, I think, when people balk at like the adjustment period with LAL that's unique from other lenses, I just think about how you position the decision of a lens at the time of cataract surgery. It's really a decision of how you want to use your eyes for the rest of your life. And so If it means a couple extra visits to help allow you to have a part in how you see and customize your visual outcome, patients get on board pretty quick. And as you mentioned, Nancy, I don't really lay that out ahead of time that we may need to delay the process for specific reasons. But I think it comes down to time is our friend, and before we rush into making a decision, let's give you some more time before we plug in the numbers and make an adjustment. So I wouldn't have approached this case any different than you did. And I think I think being patient and remembering that time is our friend is a helpful reminder during this process.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that too, with time being your friend. I feel like, especially with these RK patients, from what I've seen, definitely giving them that full 6 to 8 weeks after surgery before starting the adjustments. And then, like you did, just extending as much time as you need in between adjustments. And like Tanner mentioned, in a lot of the cases, it was because of the ocular surface. But sometimes for these RK patients, it is a stability issue. So I often will do 2 full weeks in between. And then I do think having the RK patients the same time of day for their adjustment makes a difference too. So I try to do same time of day, 2 weeks in between, and starting their adjustment 6 to 8 weeks after surgery. And I found all those things have really helped. And when in doubt, postpone. It's always better just to make sure you're getting a consistent, stable refraction before you make that adjustment. And this is just proof of that, and how both of you guys stalled the process because she was getting fluctuations. So this is a really great case because it just shows a really challenging patient being an optometrist who's refracting herself. And then on top of that, just a challenging case with her history and her ocular disease and everything.
And maybe one last final point I'll make is if you are getting into LAL, don't make your first patient a retired optometrist who's post-RK.
Yeah, not
Definitely not. No.